Going on to a second aspect of the impossible is Palestinian political competence, or lack thereof. The question that advocates of a two-state solution must be forced to confront is, why hasn't a Palestinian state been established up to now? Out of all the national freedom movements since the First World War, the movement that had the least chance of success and achieved the most dramatic results was the Zionist movement, the movement for Jewish political independence. The movement that had the best chance of success and achieved the most miserable results was the Palestinians. In fact, Palestinian deeds and Palestinian declarations raise doubts about two things. Whether the Palestinians really deserve a state, and I'll say something what I mean by deserve a state, and whether the Palestinians really desire a state. Let's start off with deserve a state. I think a very plausible, in fact a rather persuasive case can be made for saying that the Palestinians have failed the test of history. The Palestinians have enjoyed almost universal international endorsement of their claims, highly supportive international media, decades of superpower patronage by the Soviet Union. In fact, there were probably more representative offices of the PLO around the world than there were Israeli embassies. Enormous international financial aid, in fact, up to the 2000 Intifada, and perhaps even beyond that, they were the highest recipients of international aid per capita. And highly accommodative Israeli regimes which not only acknowledged but identified their claims and built their political identity around that identification. Yet in spite of that, the Palestinians have totally failed to establish any semblance of a stable, productive civil society. Under the Fatah, they managed to establish a corrupt kleptocracy. Under the Hamas, a tyrannical theocracy. And under both, chronic chaos. In fact, it was the former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, not really a very, very severe hawk, in a recent interview with the Canadian publication Maclean's, said that the Palestinians have yet to prove the capability of nationhood. A nation has to be built from within. And what's happening with the Palestinians are not creating their own nation. The Palestinians are having their nationalism forced on them from outside. It's an artificial construct. It's not genuine nationality. And this can't succeed. And why I say there's a plausible case for doubting whether Palestinians really deserve a statehood is because they failed the T.E. Lawrence test. Lawrence once said, merit is no qualification for freedom. Freedom is enjoyed when you're so well armed or so turbulent or inhabit a country so thorny that the expense of your neighbor occupying you is greater than your profit. So if success is the only criteria of being deserving, then surely the reverse is true. If you fail, it means you don't deserve it. So after 2 decades of having statehood almost thrust upon them by an eager Israeli administration and not being able to cut it, surely somewhere along the line someone has to realize that this is a hoax. Now let's have a look if Palestinians really desire statehood. There are two hypotheses. Conventional wisdom has it that the fuel of the conflict is the lack of Palestinian self-determination, and what the Palestinians really aspire to is to establish a state for themselves. But there's a competing hypothesis based on alternative logic, which says that basically what fuels the conflict is not the lack of Palestinian self-determination, but the existence of Jewish self-determination. And as long as the Jews have some self-determination, the conflict will be fueled. And what the Palestinians really aspire to is not to establish a state for themselves, but to dismantle a state for others. And if you look at some quotations from senior Palestinians. There are no differences between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. We are all part of one nation. It is only for political reasons that we carefully underline our Palestinian identity, because it is in the interest of the Arabs to encourage a separate Palestinian identity. Yes, the existence of a separate Palestinian identity serves only tactical purposes. The founding of a Palestinian state is a new tool in the continuing battle against Israel. I should argue with him. Zahir Muhsin, who is no longer with us, having fallen victim to the covert war between the Mossad and the Palestinian organizations. But he was an important Palestinian leader. And if you doubt that he was representative of what Palestinians think, then have a look at Farouk Kaddoumi, who said almost exactly the same thing in a more abbreviated form at almost exactly the same time. Palestinians and Jordanians are considered by the PLO as one people. And even King Hussein, the appearance of a Palestinian national personality comes as an answer to Israel's claim that Palestine is Jewish. In other words, if there was no claim of the Jews to Palestine, there'd be no Palestinian nation. They're only there as an artifact to counter Jewish claims. But if you look at the Palestinian National Charter, which is probably the most damning document for the Palestinians, the Palestinian people are part of an Arab nation. They must, however, at the present stage of their struggle, safeguard their Palestinian identity and develop their consciousness of that identity and oppose any plan to dissolve it. So it's all a temporary hoax. It's just a stopgap measure just to get the Jews out. And interestingly enough, Azmi Bashara, who was on Israeli TV just before, a couple of years before we had to flee the country because of suspicions of treason and helping the Hezbollah in the 2005 war. He's a self-declared Palestinian. He said, well, I don't think there is a Palestinian nation at all. I think there's an Arab nation. I always thought so. I did not change my mind. I do not think there's a Palestinian nation. I think it's a colonialist invention, Palestinian nation. When were the Palestinians? Where did they come from? I think there's an Arab nation. I think that until the end of the 19th century, Palestine was the south of Greater Syria. And even left-wing journalists in Israel are beginning to raise this question. Seva Plotzker, the economic editor of Yediot Achronot, the biggest newspaper in Israel, wrote an article, "They don't want a state." And Robert Kaplan in The Atlantic basically came to the same conclusion, that statehood is something that the Palestinians can't handle. They don't need it. He quite perversely comes to the conclusion that they should have a state anyway, having a strange sentence, why they should have a state if they don't want it and they can't be trusted, because according to Kaplan it's the right thing to do. But anyway, the point is that the issue of doubts about the Palestinian claims for statehood are growing. So if you look at these two hypotheses, the one that the conflict is fueled by the lack of Palestinian self-determination and the Palestinians are aspiring to establish a state for themselves, and the countervailing hypothesis that the fuel is Jewish self-determination and what the Palestinians aspire to is to dismantle a state for the Jews, we should ask ourselves, which of these two hypotheses have the greatest explanatory power? Because it would seem rational to base your policy on the hypothesis that has the greatest explanatory power. So there are a number of facts, which I'll go through very quickly, which cannot be explained by conventional wisdom, but can be explained by alternative wisdom. For instance, the Palestinians have rejected every proposal that would have allowed them to create a state of their own, from the 1947 partition into Barak's very generous 2000 offer at Camp David. Well, there have been various suggestions offered them, and they've all been rejected by the Palestinians. Now, if you look at Palestinian rhetoric and Palestinian symbolism, you will see that the whole of Palestine, from the river to the sea, is presented to this very day as Arab Palestine. If we look at the Islamic organizations, you can see this is Islamic Jihad and this is Hamas. That's no surprise. But if you even look at the secular organizations, like for instance the PLO, and we're negotiating with someone whose very symbol denies the existence of Israel. If you look at the Fatah, which is the biggest organization and the alleged moderates, if you look at the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is the organization of George Khabash and the late George Khabash and Ahmed Sadat, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine of Ahmed Jabril, and Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You can see all the symbolism denies the existence of a Jewish state. No trace of two states for two people. And even if you look at a recent speech given by Abu Mazen, you can see talking under a symbol where there is no existence of Israel. And if you look at Palestinian rhetoric, if you look at the words, these are clauses or paragraphs from the Hamas Charter and the Fatah Constitution. And I'm not talking about the Palestinian Charter. I'm talking about the Fatah Constitution. The Fatah is the largest faction in the PLO. And of course, the Hamas is no surprise, completely denying the existence of Israel. But I think what's interesting is the wording of the Fatah Constitution, which was not amended in the recent conference in, I think it was in Ramallah recently, or in Bethlehem, I don't remember. They had a recent conference just the end of last year. And if you look, Fatah's goal is the complete liberation of Palestine and the eradication of Zionist economic, political, military, and cultural existence. In other words, wiping everything off the face of the earth. And we know what they mean by that, because all you have to do is look at the symbols to see what they mean by Palestine. And the armed struggle is a strategy, not a tactic. In the Palestinian Arab people's armed revolution is a decisive factor in the liberation fight and in uprooting the Zionist existence. It is this struggle, and this struggle will not cease unless the Zionist state is demolished and Palestine is completely liberated. These are the moderates. If anything, Fatah is more explicit about eradicating the Jewish state than the Hamas. So you have two factions: the extreme faction that wants to eliminate Israel in the name of Islam, and the moderate faction that wants to eliminate Israel in the name of the national revolution. Then you have some more quotes here from Muhammad Dakhlan, who on TV said, I want to say this for the thousandth time in my own name, in the name of all my fellow members of the Fatah movement. We do not demand that the Hamas movement recognize Israel. On the contrary, we demand of Hamas movement not to recognize Israel, because the Fatah movement does not recognize Israel, even today, and that he said last year. The Hamas movement is not required. The Hamas is not required to recognize Israel. It is not required of Hamas or of Fatah or the Popular Front to recognize Israel. And that's our peace partner. And I think a very interesting document is the original formulation of the Palestinian Covenant. If you'll see, this was formulated in 1964, before Israel had a square centimeter of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria. And the Palestinians then were demanding to exercise national sovereignty. But what did they explicitly exclude from their demands of national sovereignty? They do not want national sovereignty over the West Bank, which they acknowledge was part of Jordan, or the Gaza Strip. These were specifically excluded from their political demands. They were only included in their demands once Israel took over the territory. So the ancient homeland of the Palestinians apparently started only the very earliest in the late 1960s, probably the 1980s, when King Hussein relinquished his demands. Because up until 1980, it was King Hussein who was demanding the West Bank. And if you listen carefully to his long speech that he made just before he gave up the claims, he said the Palestinians made a mistake. They combined two issues. One was the return of territory, and the other one was political independence. They said you must do that. You should have done that in two stages. First of all, demand return of territory to whom? To Jordan, and then demand political independence where they used to demand it, west of the Green Line. And of course, what really tears the mask off of Palestinian intentions is the demand for the right of return. Because on the one hand, they say to reach an agreement with us, you have to remove Israeli control from Palestinians living across the Green Line. But in the same breath, they say to reach an agreement with us, you must allow hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Palestinians across into Israel to live under Israeli control under the right of return, which is something which is totally incompatible with a sincere desire for two states, for two people. So, we can say that the conventional explanation has a difficult time explaining all these facts, whereas the alternative seems to be consistent with all of these. So which hypothesis should we base our policy on? The hypothesis that explains all these facts, or the hypothesis that explains none of them? I leave the answer to you. Well, having now analyzed what's impossible from Israeli security and what seems to be impossible in terms of Palestinian political ambitions and Palestinian political competence, let's have a look at what the improbable solution may be. What's been tried to solve the problem? We've tried limited autonomy. We've tried extended autonomy. We've tried negotiated sovereignty. We've tried unilateral withdrawal. So maybe we should try and look for other solutions today. Because limited authority was Camp David 1, extended autonomy was the Rabin idea, negotiated sovereignty was Oslo and its various derivatives, unilateral withdrawal was in Lebanon, Gaza, and people seem to forget northern Samaria as well. And that failed, and that failed, and that failed, and that failed. So we're left with other solutions. What form should these solutions take? Well, first thing you should understand that for Israel to survive as the nation state of the Jewish people, it has to address two imperatives: the demographic imperative and the geographic imperatives, as you've seen. But in contending with these two, in addressing these two imperatives, Israel has to face two mortal dangers: the two-state solution and the one-state solution. Because the two-state solution, as you've seen, doesn't address the geographic imperative, and the one-state solution doesn't address the demographic imperative. And today, the major challenge, I think, facing Zionism today, if you compare the challenge of the Palestinian issue and the Iranian issue, the Iranian issue may or may not endanger the physical existence of the State of Israel and may or may not be able to be preempted. But the Palestinian issue endangers the very conceptual legitimacy of Zionism, of the idea of a Jewish nation state. And it undermines Israeli deterrence. It creates demonization of Israel. It divides Israeli society and causes delegitimization of Israel in the world. And in fact, it intensifies the Iranian threat, because the only country that Ahmadinejad dares to threaten with annihilation is Israel. It doesn't dare threaten anyone else. And the increasing delegitimization of Israel through the Palestinian issue makes it an increasingly legitimate target. Because recently, I'll give you an example, in a recent publication by an Australian student organization, someone said, well, I hope the Iranians nuke them. So it's not only become an increasingly legitimate target, but its defense options are being made more limited and more constrained and being considered illegitimate. So, if you look what this has caused, I think some of you have seen this in an earlier lecture. if you do a Google search and you give the name of a country and its right to exist, most countries come up with less than 10 hits. Brazil 2, Mexico, Spain, Sweden, between 1 and 10. Lithuania has 10, 9. Tibet and Georgia have round about 130. Jordan has 400. Lebanon has about 8,000. If you run Israel, you get 1.7 million. That means the right to exist of Israel is on the agenda, and that's all through the Palestinian issue. So the major challenge that Zionism has today is to delegitimize the Palestinian narrative, and the Palestinians have already given you a heads up how to do it, because they don't really desire a state and they don't really deserve a state, not because I say so, because they say so. Not because I say so, because historical facts prove it. So that is the major challenge of Zionism today, and it is a precondition for designing an alternative option to deal with what's facing Israel today. So we have to remove the issue of Palestinian statehood from their national agenda, and that's easier said than done. It's easy to write on a PowerPoint presentation, but that's not an easy thing to do. And the way to do that, as I said before, is to delegitimize the Palestinian narrative that fuels the demands for Palestinian nationhood. Now, is this possible? Well, if you look at Israel's public diplomacy efforts today, you'll see that what they're spending is puny. I don't want to go into this, I spoke at some length earlier. But just imagine that Israel were to spend 0.75% of its GNP on public diplomacy. That would be almost $1 billion compared to $30 million today. That should make some difference. That should make some impact. So just by throwing more resources at the problem, you should be able to start moving along the right path. But I don't want to go into that detail. That's sort of a side issue in this lecture. But the removal of the issue of Palestinian state from the international agenda, if we manage to do that, does not remove the problem of the genuine Palestinian plight in the territories. And this is something that must be addressed. But the first step is to depoliticize the solution and reformulate the Palestinian problem in humanitarian terms rather than political terms. And I'm going to suggest briefly an alternative paradigm based on 3 elements, all of which I believe can easily be reconciled with liberal political theory. First of all, to eliminate discrimination in the treatment of Palestinians on 2 levels. One as refugees, and one as residents in the Arab world. And the third element will be to facilitate freedom of choice for individual Palestinians living inside what's known as the occupied territories. Let's start off with the issue of eliminating discrimination in the treatment of Palestinians. First of all, as refugees, and this means focusing on UNRWA, which is becoming, by the way, a center or a focus of international debate lately. And as if you've seen, Canada has stopped its funding of UNRWA. And the second element we'll discuss a little later is the elimination of ethnic discrimination against Palestinians in Arab countries. So let's start off with UNRWA. It's important to realize that all the refugees on the face of the globe are under the auspices of an organization called the UN High Commission for Refugees, except the Palestinians. The Palestinians have their own organization called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. These two organizations have different definitions of who a refugee is and a different mandate of how to deal with him. According to the High Commission definition, the number of refugees decreases over time. According to the UNRWA definition, the number of refugees increases over time. According to the High Commission mandate, they can find permanent solutions for refugees, in the area, in the countries of residence, not necessarily their country of origin. According to the UNRWA mandate, all they can do is take care of the humanitarian needs. So if you combine the UNRWA definition and the UNRWA mandate, you come to the conclusion that UNRWA is an organization that perpetuates the problem it's supposed to deal with. And that's becoming more and more evident to people in the international community today. More and more articles are being written about it. And that's the biggest stumbling block. Without dealing with UNRWA, there's no way that you're going to find a solution, because it perpetuates the culture of dependency and perpetuates the narrative of return. And these are examples of some articles. By the way, if people want this presentation, I'm prepared to make it available probably through Doris, if you want to look through some of these things in greater detail. These are more and more articles that are appearing recently, focusing on the anomaly of UNRWA. Because you must understand, it's not just an Israeli problem. The High Commission, with a staff of 5,000 people, has a client population of 30 million, and they normally solve those problems for refugees, whether it's tsunamis, earthquakes, political persecution, famine. They normally solve these problems within less than 2 generations. UNRWA, with a staff 5 times the size of 25,000 and a client population 5 times smaller, about 5 million, of bogus refugees, because they wouldn't qualify as refugees under any international definition, hasn't solved this for nearly 7 decades. In fact, people say that if you apply the universally valid definition of refugees to the Palestinian issue, the number of refugees would shrink from about 5 million to 200,000. So in other words, 95% of the problem is the anomalous definition of the problem. But perhaps one of the interesting quotes is from Scott Lasansky, who received the Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin Peace Prize at Tel Aviv University and was in the Clinton regime's peace team. And he says the current situation, particularly the delivery of international assistance through UNRWA, is untenable and does nothing to contribute to eventual settlement. And Tom Lantis recognized this, saying, frankly, I am baffled as to why more than 50 years after the founding of the State of Israel, there continues to exist a UN organization focused solely on the Palestinian refugees. Why, as an agency that was established on a temporary basis, evolved into a permanent institution which just had big celebrations marking their 60th anniversary and saying they hope to expand their activities, and it's completely perverse. That is outside the administrative and policy jurisdiction of other UN voluntary organizations. No other refugee problem in the world has been treated in this privileged and prolonged manner, and as I said recently, Canada has just realized this and stopped funding them. And I must say, if you don't agree with anything that I've said up to now, and you don't agree with anything that I say from now on, UNRWA is a standalone issue. And this is something that pressure must be brought to bear through Congress on the funding of this organization. Because if UNRWA is dismantled, if UNRWA is folded into the High Commission, or has its mandate changed to be a clone of the High Commission, everything else will fall into place. That is the major stumbling block. That's the log jam. That's the log jam stopping any solution. So the first issue is to change the definition of the Palestinian refugee. The second is to focus on the Palestinians living in Arab countries. Not long ago, Saudi Arabia enacted legislation which made it easier for non-Saudi residents in the kingdom to acquire Saudi citizenship. This offer was valid for all the nationalities of the world in the Saudi kingdom, except the Palestinians. And the same kind of discrimination is in place across the Arab world, whether it is for property rights, employment opportunities, freedom of movement. And the spokesman of the Arab League was interviewed in the LA Times. He was asked to explain this, and this is what he said. He said, well, I know that the Palestinians live in very bad conditions, but this is the official policy is meant to preserve their national identity. if every Palestinian who sought refuge in a certain country were integrated and accommodated in that country, there won't be any reason for them to return to Palestine. From which we learn that the people guarding Palestinian nationality most zealously are not the Palestinians, but the other guys. Which, by the way, completely endorses what Ephraim Halevi said previously, that the nationality is being imposed on them from outside. It's not something internal, it's not a genuine desire. And there's an interesting article that appeared in Haaretz that first of all focused on the state of the Palestinians in Lebanon. The lives of the refugees in El Khilwa and other camps have become even more difficult. Notice that they're talking about camps in the Arab world. Searches conducted by Lebanese soldiers at roadblocks, but no women of black protesting it, at the entrance of each camp have become much longer and much more stringent, and the residents now have to spend at least half a day at the entrance to the respective camps when they leave and when they return. No international protest. Abu Mazen set off another bomb. In a television interview, he requested that Arab states grant citizens, not me, Abu Mazen, asked for citizenship to be granted to them, to the Arab states, to the Palestinians in the Arab states. And this caused a turmoil in the Arab world. Leading Arab television stations like Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera quickly conducted opinion polls on Abu Mazen's appeal, in which more than 80% of the participants expressed the view that the granting of citizenship to the refugees would ring the death knell to the right of return. The Arabs. However, the two stations began to interview Palestinians living in various Arab states, and it soon became evident that the polls did not reflect the thinking of the Palestinian refugees, the vast majority of whom very much wanted to become citizens in the country of their residence. And of course, one of the reasons that Abu Mazen is asking for this is because he knows that even if the Palestinian state is set up, the right of return, whether voluntary or forced, will totally implode his state, because there's no way that the Palestinian state could absorb millions of refugees returning. But interesting enough, Khalil Shkaki, the best-known Palestinian pollster, had his office trashed because that's what he found in his polls. He found that the Palestinians weren't going to demand the right of return. The Palestinians are human beings with needs. He says these people want to get on their lives. They're tired of being national standard bearers. They want a solution in their place of residence, not the promise of return in decades and decades to come. So the first two elements are folding UNRWA into the High Commission, which would mean many Palestinians living in the Arab world would no longer receive handouts, which are not offered to any other refugee group, by the way. And as I said before, this is not only an Israeli issue, it's an international issue. Because if humanity decides they want to allot X amount of resources to deal with refugees, whether tsunami, earthquakes, political persecution, etc., etc., why should one group have an increasing slice of the cake and everybody else a decreasing slice of the cake? That's not fair. So what you have to do then is bring pressure to bear, at least diplomatic pressure, on the Arabs to absorb people who've been resident in their country for decades. The third element now relates to the real hot potato, what to do with the Palestinians under Israeli administration. And now I'm going to suggest the following. First of all, offering them generous rehabilitation loans to relocate elsewhere, and to atomize it. And by that I mean offering it directly to Palestinian breadwinners and family heads, not through some Palestinian apparatus, directly to them. And some people may raise an eyebrow. But let me say, first of all, on the conceptual level, what would this mean in terms of rational choice for the individual? He could choose to continue the life under the rigors of Israeli control, or if he has really bad luck, he can live under Palestinian regime, which has proved to be more dysfunctional, more repressive and more aggressive. Or he can take a very considerable sum of money and go and build a better life for himself elsewhere, for his family. seems that's the logical solution for him to adopt. Now, I did a survey. This was a genuine survey in 2004 with a reputable Israeli polling company in collaboration with the well-known Palestinian Survey Institute. And what we found was that only 15% of the sample, in which the refugees, by the way, were underrepresented, only 15% said nothing would convince them to leave. Over 70% mentioned something that could be translated into money, like better housing, better job, better education, etc., which would convince them to emigrate. Now, I'm not suggesting at the moment that this is set in stone, but it's certainly better than the intuitive statement, just nothing, they'll never leave. And this has been endorsed by surveys conducted by the Palestinians themselves. A lot of articles have come out showing that there's a huge desire for the Palestinians to leave, and who can blame them? For instance, in Bill Zait ran a survey among young Palestinians without putting specific economic inducements on the table, and found that almost half of them, and over half the males, would leave if they had the chance. And what I'm saying is give them the chance. And a similar survey by the Al-Najaf University also found that there's a large desire for the Palestinians to leave the territories. And why shouldn't they seek a better life elsewhere? And I believe this is a solution which has impeccable liberal or libertarian credentials. This is a quote from Herbert Hoover, who was dubbed the great humanitarian. Consideration should be given even to the heroic remedy of transfer of population. The great hardship, the hardship of moving is great, but it is less than the constant suffering of minorities and the constant recurrence of war. Who disagrees with that? And Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident and the human rights activist, said, with all the money that has been invested in the problem of the Palestinians, it would have been possible long ago to resettle them and provide them with good lives in Arab countries. And even our friend Scott Lesensky from the Clinton administration and the recipient of the Peace Prize named after Rabin and Peres said the collapse of the Oslo process and the ever-worsening Israeli-Palestinian violence demonstrates that certain long-held truths about the conflict need to be turned on their heads. The U.S. should launch an international initiative that would provide economic support for refugees in neighboring states, including host governments, and provide incentives packages for repatriation to non-neighboring states, including the West. So he's accepted the principle. We may argue about the scale, but the principle is no longer in dispute. And even Yossi Beilin is going around asking that the UN should absorb refugees. Again, we may not agree on the scope, but the principle has been established. Now, when we just talk about the cost. The cost, in many ways, is irrelevant. I don't want to diminish the issue of cost. But first of all, it will be a fraction of what the U.S. has already spent on the war against terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. But you must understand, the absolute cost of it is not something that has a standalone issue. It must be compared to the alternative. And the present situation is not free either. And if you were thinking of setting up a Palestinian state, it will cost probably more to set up the infrastructure for a failed state, to bring the Palestinian diaspora from there to here, which is not going to be cheaper than bringing Palestinians from here to there. But my estimates of the cost, depending on how many Palestinians you believe there are, and what the level of compensation, would be anywhere between $90 billion to $200 billion. Now this might sound a lot, but given the fact that Israel's GNP per capita is about 150 billion, it's something that Israel basically could finance for itself without any aid over a decade and a half. But if it acquired international legitimacy, it would be a fraction of the GNP per capita of the developed world. It would be nothing. It wouldn't even be felt. And by the way, I once explained this plan to an Indian MP, and he said to me, "Tell me, how many Palestinians are you?" I said, "I don't know, about 3-4 million." He said, "Is that all? We'll take them." It's really not a big problem. If you approach the Palestinian problem in humanitarian terms, it's not a big problem. So this is a solution which, if adopted, would alleviate and probably eliminate the humanitarian plight of individual Palestinians, ensure the continued security and survival of Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people, provide a significant boost to the economies of the developing world. That's an important point. Let me explain what I mean by that. Suppose, this is an unrealistic but illustrated example. Suppose all the Palestinians decided they want to go to Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world, and Indonesia decided they wanted to accept it. What would be the result of this? An increase of 1% of the Indonesian population. Every single Palestinian breadwinner would arrive in there, would have almost a century's worth of GNP per capita in his pocket. And Indonesia would receive an influx of capital of anything between $100 and $200 billion. Sounds like win-win to me. And if you want to understand the order of magnitude here, someone arriving with the envisaged compensation at the gates of Indonesia would be someone arriving as a family head at the gates of the United States with $3 million. That's the comparison. And of course, this would transform the poverty-stricken refugees into affluent immigrants. What about feasibility? First of all, what's proved unfeasible is territorial compromise. It's been tried for 2 decades and failed miserably and brought only death and destruction to both people. Every single territorial compromise has been rejected and failed. And it was Einstein who said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for different results. And George Santayana said, fanaticism is redoubling your efforts having lost sight of the objective. So we're left to decide whether land for peace is insane fanaticism or fanatical insanity. So before you even decide about the practical feasibility of what I'm suggesting, first of all, anyone who suggests a two-state solution is the last person who can invoke feasibility as a criticism. But what would be wrong for discussing, before we even go to discussing an alternative, which would make the lives of the individual recipients better, produce benefits for the host country at a relatively acceptable economic cost? I think it's worth at least putting on the agenda to discuss it and try and acquire legitimacy for the idea. And we're near the end. But I want to just give you a quote again from Amnon Rubinstein, who said, of all the Palestinian lies, there's no lie greater or more crushing than that which calls for the establishment of the separate Palestinian state. Meret's education minister. Not since the time of Dr. Goebbels, the head of the Nazi propaganda machine, has there ever been a case in which the continued repetition of a lie has borne such great fruits. And then, of course, we should remember, if you want an explanation for this, maybe we should go to the poet, Nathan Altman. And then Satan said unto himself, this besieged foe, how is to be overcome? Both courage and skill are his. He is well armed and well alert. Then Satan said, not his strength shall I sap, nor bridle and muzzle shall I place on him, nor fear shall I bring into his heart, nor cause him to be weak as he once was. All I shall do is this, his mind shall I dull, and make him forget that righteousness is with him. And that's the problem. We've forgotten who the good guys are. And this probably would be a good place to stop, but you mustn't forget Sherlock Holmes. And we have his quote, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And what have we eliminated? We've eliminated that, and we've eliminated that, and we've eliminated that, and we've eliminated that. So we're left with other solutions. And the question is, what would Sherlock Holmes have said about reframing the Palestinian problem in terms of humanitarian paradigm rather than the political paradigm? I think we all know.